Ever think about like what was going on in the Middle East and Arabia between, the time of Jesus and then like way later when Islam emerges, and it's like this kind of blank spot in history for a lot of us.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Most people just skip over it.
Hmm.
But actually, when you dig into the academic research, it's a super dynamic period.
So for this deep dive, we're going to pull out like the most important and surprising things from the research.
So exactly. We want to paint you a picture of all the religious, political, and cultural transformations that were already happening before Islam came onto the scene.
Okay, so let's start with like the religious landscape. It seems like early Christianity, it wasn't just like a small, quiet thing, was it?
Oh, no, 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 not at all.
Yeah.
It spread incredibly fast like wildfire.
Yeah.
From its roots as a Jewish sect, it just exploded outward, using existing trade routes and social networks.
What?
Yeah, and by the year 100 AD, get this, there are already over 40 Christian communities, all across the Mediterranean, Anatolia, Rome, even down to Ethiopia and over to places like Syria. They were often meeting in these simple house churches.
That's amazing, but I imagine early Christianity wasn't like one big unified thing, right?
Yet there was so much diversity. Like
Yeah.
different communities had different interpretations of Jesus. The church in Rome had its views. North Africa had its own thing going on. Syria as well, and so on.
So many different flavors.
Oh, yeah. You had the Pauline tradition, which really focused on faith and grace. But then you also had Gnostic Christianity, which emphasized like secret knowledge and spiritual enlightenment. And in some places like Alexandria, you had Christian thinkers who were incorporating ideas from pagan religions and Greek philosophy, stuff like Neoplatonism and the concept of the logos.
So they were really trying to make sense of Christianity in light of their existing worldviews.
Precisely. But all this diversity eventually led to some conflicts and tension. And that eventually led to a push for like a more unified doctrine, like what happened to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD.
That makes sense. So while Christianity was expanding and changing, what was happening with Judaism, especially after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD?
Yeah, the destruction of the Second Temple was a turning point, no question. That and the Bar Kokhba revolt later on really pushed the development of what we now call Rabbinic Judaism.
So what did that look like?
Well, around the year 200, you have the Mishnah. This was a huge step because it was the first written collection of the oral laws that had been passed down for generations, like guiding everyday Jewish life.
It's like they finally wrote down their rule book.
Yeah, you could say that.
Yeah.
And then later, in the 4th and 5th centuries, you had the Palestinian and Babylonian Talmuds. These were massive works that combined the Mishnah with interpretations of the Hebrew Bible, and they really went deep on a wide range of topics.
So like a commentary on the Mishnah.
Yeah, but it went beyond just explaining the Mishnah.
Yeah.
It explored all sorts of things like philosophy, theology, history, ethics, really anything you can think of.
It sounds like a treasure trove of knowledge.
It really is. And during this time, major centers of Jewish learning emerged in Palestine and Babylonia. The rabbi became the central authority, the interpreter of both the written and oral Torah. And just like with Christianity, Rabbinic Judaism didn't exist in a vacuum. It interacted with other cultures around it, like the Greco-Roman world and Iranian culture. And later on, even with early Islam.
So it was a dynamic period for Judaism as well.
Absolutely. Lots of change and adaptation.
Now, over in Persia, you had the rise of Zoroastrianism, right?
Exactly. With the rise of the Sasanian dynasty in 224 AD, Zoroastrianism became the official state religion. They really pushed it hard.
And were they tolerant of other religions?
Not always, no. They had their own beliefs and they stuck to them pretty rigidly. Under the Sasanians, the Zoroastrian holy texts, the Avesta and the Zan, were compiled and standardized. And Zoroastrian ideas had a huge impact on Sasanian law, their social structure, even their political ideology. The Zoroastrian clergy, they had a really close relationship with the state. They had land, influence, even sometimes used slave labor.
So it wasn't just the spiritual belief system, it was really embedded in the power structure.
Yeah, very much so. At the core of Zoroastrianism, you have Ahura Mazda, the one God, the source of all good. And then there's this dualistic element, with Ahura Mazda opposed by Angra Mainyu, the evil spirit.
Good versus evil, the classic struggle. Okay, so we've talked about the big players, but what about Arabia itself before Islam? What were the religious beliefs there?
This is where things get really interesting. For a long time, the dominant belief system was polytheism. People worshipped a whole pantheon of gods like Hubal, Allat, Al-Uzza, Manat, even supernatural beings like jinns and ghouls.
You're right, the Kaaba in Mecca,
Yeah.
it was originally a polytheistic shrine.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Around the 4th century AD, something really interesting starts to happen. you see this major shift towards monotheism.
So from many gods to one.
Yeah, exactly. We see this in the archaeological record. Like inscriptions across Arabia start showing fewer and fewer mentions of all these different gods. Instead, they're increasingly talking about a single god. They use different names for this god, like Allah, Al-Ilah, Rab, Ramanan, and others.
And this wasn't just happening on the fringes of Arabia.
No, it was a widespread phenomenon.
Yeah.
It seems like there was this internal religious transformation happening across the Arabian Peninsula.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So what was driving this shift?
Well, there were probably many factors, but one interesting group were the Hunafa. These were individuals who, even before Islam, rejected polytheism and embraced a strict monotheism. They saw themselves as following in the footsteps of Abraham, who they believed was the original monotheist. They didn't identify as Jewish or Christian, but they were definitely moving in a monotheistic direction. And then down in Yemen, in the kingdom of Himyar, there was a whole regional form of monotheism called Ramanism. It even briefly became the state religion there.
Brahmanism.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case. And it shows that this shift toward monotheism was happening in different parts of Arabia in different ways. And there's another layer to this story. You also had established Jewish and Christian communities in Arabia.
So not just these kind of homegrown monotheistic ideas, but also influence from outside.
Right. And these communities weren't just small, isolated groups either. They had real presence. Like, Jewish communities had been in Northwest and South Arabia since at least the 1st century AD. Oh yeah, there's archaeological evidence of synagogues, inscriptions mentioning rabbis, and a lot of Jewish names popping up in various texts. Down in Yemen, in the 4th century AD, the Himyarite ruling elite actually converted to Judaism. This led to a period where Judaism had significant influence there, and that's part of what contributed to the development of Ramanism.
So it's all connected.
Exactly. It's this incredibly rich tapestry. And then you have the Christian communities, which were also growing quite a bit, especially after Emperor Constantine made Christianity legal in the Roman Empire. They were influenced by the Byzantine Empire in the northwest, Nestorian Christianity from Persia in the northeast, and even the Aksumite Empire in Ethiopia, which had influence down in South Arabia. Some major Arab tribes, like the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids, were actually partially or even fully Christianized.
Wow, so Christianity was pretty widespread too.
Yeah, and we have the archaeological evidence to prove it. There are remains of churches and monasteries and tons of inscriptions mentioning Christian figures and using Christian terminology, like the term Al-Ilah for God. These communities weren't just hanging out in the background, they were actively involved in Arabian society and politics. Some even held positions of power. And it's important to remember that the way they practiced Judaism and Christianity in Arabia, it wasn't exactly the same as in other parts of the world. They developed their own regional flavors and traditions.
So this whole period leading up to the rise of Islam, it was a melting pot of religious ideas and influences.
Exactly. You've got this growing trend toward monotheism, the influence of Jewish and Christian communities, and the emergence of uniquely Arabian forms of monotheism like Ramanism. It's this incredibly dynamic period.
It really makes you wonder how all of this mixing and changing, how it might have shaped the way people in Arabia first reacted to the message of Islam, and how it influenced the early development of Islam itself.
It's a question worth pondering, for sure.
Yeah. It really shows that you can't understand the rise of Islam without understanding the centuries that came before it. There was so much already happening, setting the stage.
Exactly, and it's all there in the historical record, waiting to be explored.
Well, thanks for taking us on this deep dive into this fascinating period of history. It really makes you think. And for our listeners, if you want to learn more about this period, don't just take our word for it. Dig into those primary sources, check out the archaeological discoveries, and see for yourself just how dynamic and complex pre-Islamic Arabia really was. It's a journey worth taking.